High functioning anxiety can show up a lot at work, and it's important to recognize how to cope with it so you can prevent sliding into burnout, more stress, and frustration. Some of the ways that high functioning anxiety shows up at work that I'll be talking about include people pleasing, overworking, putting too much pressure on yourself, poor boundaries, overthinking, anxiety, burnout, self-doubt, and fear of failure, just to name a few. So get your notebook out and get ready to learn 7 tips to cope with high-functioning anxiety at work. Welcome to Calmly Coping. My name is Tati, and I am a licensed therapist and coach specializing in high-functioning anxiety. I help high achievers overcome high-functioning anxiety so they can finally stop overthinking everything. If you're interested in this topic, then please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you get notified whenever I release a new episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so now here are my 7 tips for how to cope with high-functioning anxiety at work. Tip number 1 is to ask for help or delegate, depending on the situation. And this is to prevent spinning into that place of overworking and putting too much pressure on yourself. When you struggle with high-functioning anxiety, it can be really easy to get stuck in a place of having those unrealistic and high expectations for yourself, and so feeling as though you have to do it all. And then as a result, you continue to say yes to more and add more to your plate because of this internal feeling of maybe not feeling good enough. And so this can drive that desire to continue to put more on your plate and to have these high expectations for yourself. Asking for help and delegating can really help with this because then you're recognizing that no, you can't do it all. And that's just part of being human. Nobody can do it all. And it's okay to admit that you do need somebody else to help, or, whether it's in one situation or you can delegate to other people so that you're not having to do everything on your own. So this can take a lot of courage to actually get to that step. This is something that I recently started doing in my business, delegating by hiring a VA and somebody to edit my videos and podcast episodes. And, whether or not you have the financial means to do so by either, hiring somebody to help you out to clean your home to free up more time so that you can have time for doing the things that you enjoy, or whether it means just asking for help from a colleague or from a partner to help to do things that might pick up the slack for you. Asking for help at home can be a way of coping with that stress that comes up at work because it's inevitable. When you have more stress at home, then it can make it more difficult to cope with the stress that can come up at work. So tip number 2 to cope with high-functioning anxiety at work is to set boundaries. So this could include in regards to helping others, maybe your working hours, maybe when you want to respond to email. And this is so that you can combat those tendencies towards people-pleasing, towards having poor boundaries, and even towards things like overthinking. So let's say if you set boundaries and decide that if somebody asks you for help about a certain topic, then it's not something that you may be able to automatically help them with if you're busy with other things, if you don't have time for it. So this is a way of setting those boundaries at work so that you're not constantly having your time hijacked by other people or other requests. Other more concrete boundaries can be, like I mentioned, setting work hours. So saying that you're only going to be doing work between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. and then you're going to shut down and not check email after this time or anything else unless, let's say, it's an emergency or some sort of exception comes up depending upon your work. So this can also help with overthinking because the less boundaries that you have between your work and your personal life, then the easier it's going to be to constantly have it on your mind. If you're checking email after work hours or in the middle of the night or on weekends, then it's obviously going to be on your mind. And then this is going to potentially trigger that overthinking that can come up. So when you are creating these separations and these boundaries in your time and in your schedule, then that can help to decrease that overthinking. And when you're creating boundaries when it comes to who you're able to help, what you're willing to do, if your boss asks you to do something that you're unable to do, you can frame it in a way as to, I have these other priorities. Is this something that you want me to prioritize above these things that I already have? So that you're setting that boundary that it's impossible for you to focus on everything at once. So what is the most important? So these are just some ways that setting boundaries can help you to cope with that high functioning anxiety and increased stress you might struggle with at work. Tip number 3 is to identify anxiety and stress triggers and to identify coping mechanisms for them. So this is to combat the anxiety that might come up for you during the day. So some examples of triggers might be having too much on your to-do list, maybe having too many meetings back to back and not enough white space in your schedule or space to breathe. Maybe it's having multiple deadlines at once, falling into a place of procrastination or putting things off. So identify what those triggers are for you that result in more stress and maybe overthinking and anxiety, and then recognize either how you can prevent them from happening in the first place, if that's possible. If it's something like having way too much on your to-do list, maybe you can limit yourself to only a few things on your list for the day and then schedule things out depending upon what the importance is of these tasks. Or if it's having too many meetings back to back, maybe it's setting a limit for yourself. So I like to set limits when it comes to how many meetings or how many client appointments I have back to back. So my personal limit is not having any more than 3 clients back to back, because then after that I need a break. And so that's something that I'm aware of. So I set that boundary in my schedule. And that connects to number 2, which is setting boundaries. And I also recognize that this is a trigger for me if I do any more than that, because then I'm going to start feeling drained, overwhelmed, and frustrated. So figure out how you can cope with these things if it's something that you're not able to plan ahead to prevent. So for example, maybe it's something like taking deep breaths if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed, practicing positive self-talk by saying kind things to yourself if you are struggling, getting support from loved ones, maybe it's a therapist, a coach, or a colleague. Tip number 4 is to have a morning routine before work so that you can practice self-care before your day begins. And this is to combat things like burnout and more anxiety and stress. So I talked all about how to create a morning routine in my last podcast episode. If you click on the link, if you're watching on YouTube, you can head over and check out that video. I talk about the secret to a simple morning routine that sticks. And you can also check out my previous episodes on my podcast to listen to that. The reasons why a morning routine can be helpful is because this is a practice of taking care of yourself first so that you're carving out that time for self-care. And I like to view burnout as the process of you're giving more than you're receiving or giving to yourself. Like you're giving more to others. And whether that is through caregiving for a child or a family member or a pet, or it is through work, then, you're giving to your colleagues, to your clients, to your boss, to whatever it is, and you're not taking that time to care for yourself. High functioning anxiety can lead to burnout. And I have an episode about that as well that you can check out. And I'm going to leave a link to that as well about how high functioning anxiety leads to burnout. So even taking a few minutes in the morning, even if it's just 5 to 15 minutes to practice self-care and to practice a morning routine can help you to cope with high-functioning anxiety in the long run. So I want to talk quickly about my free high-functioning anxiety quiz. So you can take this by going to hfaquiz.com. And once you take this quiz, it will let you know your level that you're struggling with high-functioning anxiety if you are. And then I will give you free personalized resources so that you can identify what the next steps you can take in order to cope with the high functioning anxiety you're struggling with. Again, you can get this by going to hfaquiz.com or clicking on the link in the show notes. Tip number 5 to cope with high functioning anxiety at work is to take regular breaks whenever possible and to do something that is recharging. So this is going to prevent you from going into that place of burnout or overworking. Overworking, like when you're in that place of kind of just pushing through and pushing past your limits and saying, I'm going to keep working and keep doing this, even though everything in your mind and body is telling you to stop and slow down. Taking breaks can be really helpful and really important because we all go through these daily rhythms during the day. So most of you might know about circadian rhythms. So these are the sleep and wake cycles that we go through as humans and many animals as well. So that we're awake during the day and we're sleeping at night. And within those circadian rhythms are what are called ultradian rhythms. And so these are the periods in which we have more energy and then we need to recharge. So typically it is about 90 minutes of having more energy. So where there's periods of 90 minutes where you have more energy, and then about 15 minutes where you need to rest and recharge, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. So it depends person to person, of course, but this is something that's important to be aware of, that if you just continue to push through these breaks and these periods that you need to recharge, then it's going to build up. And this is going to result in you feeling more stressed and overwhelmed, and then potentially could be triggering for you in regards to anxiety. So that's why it's important to schedule these breaks. And I know everybody's work situation is different, whether you get breaks that are already scheduled in advance, or maybe if you have a job where you're a teacher or something and it's difficult for you to take a break. Whenever you can, take that break and do something that is going to allow you to calm your mind, not something that's going to be more triggering. So let's say scrolling through social media, that might be something that's more triggering and stressful. Maybe it's doing something like going for a walk or doing a guided meditation, taking some deep breaths. Maybe it is reading a book that you enjoy, figuring out what it is that's going to be recharging for you and using that time intentionally throughout your day. Tip number 6 is to take action. So if you're in a place of overthinking things, just do the thing, because this is going to help you to get out of that place of overthinking. So maybe it is sending that email or making that phone call or scheduling that meeting or talking to that customer, doing and starting to face the things that make you anxious so that you're not slowed down and you're not increasing that anxiety by delaying things and by procrastinating the things that are more difficult for you. Oftentimes, once you do something that you've been avoiding or something that's difficult, then there can be that feeling of relief and that feeling of confidence that comes afterwards. And tip number 7 is to practice self-compassion while also objectively assessing your work. So what I mean by this is to not base your perception of the way that you're doing off of your emotions, like the way that you're feeling or your mood that day, or even off of negative feedback from your boss or from others. It's not to say to discount this completely, but as humans, we have a negativity bias. And so we are prone to focus more on the negative and disregard any positive. And sometimes it can be more difficult in workplaces for people to give that positive feedback than it is to give negative feedback, unfortunately. And so this kind of just exaggerates that tendency to think that you're doing terribly, when in reality, that might not be an objective viewpoint of what's actually happening. So this can be really helpful to combat self-doubt, perfectionism, or that fear of failure. So self-compassion is just the act of being kind to yourself and speaking to yourself like you would to a friend. So just practice grace, and then also recognize all of the accomplishments that you've done, all of the things that you've done well, or even the things that you've done better, or maybe that you have done it all that you might not have done in the past, maybe the things that you've learned or the ways that you've grown as a person in your job. So these are all ways that you can look back and reflect in order to objectively assess how you're doing. So those are my 7 tips to cope with high-functioning anxiety at work. Your action tip is to take 2 of these tips and put them into action within the next 2 weeks. So the tips were asking for help or delegating, setting boundaries, identifying your anxiety and stress triggers and how you can cope with or prevent them, having a morning routine to practice self-care, taking regular breaks, taking action and facing your fears, and practicing self-compassion while objectively assessing your work. If you're interested in joining the conversation about high-functioning anxiety, then you can join my free Facebook group for high achievers with high-functioning anxiety called Calmly Coping. You can join by going to calmlycoping.com/group or clicking on the link in the show notes. While you wait for next week's episode, I have other episodes about decreasing your anxiety, adopting a healthy mindset, and managing your time and energy. So be sure you check out these videos right here. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and until next time, be calm.